My name is David Akoubian. I'm the owner and operator of Birdwatching Photography, and I'm also a Tamron image master. And I wanted to take a little bit of time to talk about backyard bird photography, what you can do to set up a bird studio, what kind of gear you need, and the settings and stuff to photograph it as well. Before we get into all of that, though, I think it's important that I sort of give a background as to what we did here in our property to convert and build that backyard bird studio as well as a wildlife sanctuary. My wife and I live here in the North Georgia mountains, and we've named our little place here Bear Woods because we live in bear country. So we have a lot of bears wandering in and out, never have harmed us. We could care less. We live with them, so that's all it takes. But when we bought our house, the person who had built it really didn't have the mountain environment in mind. It's sort of like they wanted to create a, for lack of a better term, almost a rural property in the mountains. And that really didn't work well, because what they did is on the side of a mountain, they cleared about a quarter to a third of an acre and leveled it so they could build a ranch on a slab. Most people up here build, on the side of the mountain, and you have, multi-levels, you have a basement and everything else. Well, it was pretty, I'm sure, for her, but what it did was it sort of interrupted the natural environment that was here in the mountains. And when I say interrupted, I think more of, you look at just the woodlands. You've got this high canopy, you've got an area below it that's a lower canopy, shrubs, trees, small bushes, stuff like that. And she removed all that. So when I first, my first year here, we were sort of excited at the idea of being on the eastern flyway, so to speak, of the migration of the warblers and everything else. And down about an hour south of here, 45 minutes or so, there's a place called Kennesaw Mountain that I used to do a lot of my birding at, and I would see 10, 15, 20 species of warblers in a season. But coming up here, I thought, I'll see every one of those and hopefully more. Well, the first 2 years that I started photographing, I only saw 6 species of warblers in the yard, and that was a little bit disturbing to me. So I started doing some more research and decided that what we needed to do was to return as much of the property as possible to its natural state, and while still maintaining a yard and some other things. I'm not a big fan of cutting grass, but it's there. So what we did is I consulted with several web pages, one of them being the Atlanta Audubon Society, and then a friend who is active with the Atlanta Audubon Society. It gave me recommendations what to do. And the first thing we did was go in and start taking out all the non-native species of plants and replacing them with native species of plants. And it amazed me how many flowers were not natural to this environment. They were more of western flowers, not southeastern flowers. So we started doing all that. Then we started looking at some other things we could do. And a friend of mine who is a beekeeper asked about putting some bees up here and was going to teach me to be a beekeeper as well. And so we cleared an area that we put some beehives. We had some senior golden retrievers at the time, and to make sure they were safe from the bears and there was never any issues, we put a small fence around the backyard, and it would just keep the bears out. It's got a small electrical charge. It's like a cattle fence, and we needed that because with the bees we had to enclose the bee area to keep the bears out of that. So we were doing things that was very minimal disturbance to the property and to the environment, but at the same time trying to keep everything safe. So since that time I've moved the bees to a different area, but we're going to get some dogs again, so we've left the fence up. So once we got the bees in, we started getting natural flowers, and we noticed how great things were going because the bees were pollinating, we were getting lots of seeds and so on and so on. And I remembered a book that I had read years and years ago, Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, and we weren't really using a lot of pesticides or herbicides or insecticides, but we wanted to go ahead and minimize, if not eliminate, all of that, and we were able to eliminate it just by simply using elbow grease. We do use the only herbicide, I guess, that we use at this point in time is vinegar and Epsom salt. And, we'd use it just enough to kill off the greenery, then we dig up the roots and everything else. But it's not harmful to the environment. The bees don't, mind it, anything else. But we don't use any Roundups or any insecticides, anything else. And part of the idea of that is, as we started bringing in these native flowers, everything that I read talked about the natural decay of stuff. And you needed insects for that decay, because they would go in and they would eat the shoots and the stems and everything else. And we found out very, very quickly that those insects that were aiding in the decay also attracted in many, many more birds because they were feeding on them. Now, in the bird studio, which I'll show you, we have primarily in the summertime, we have a mealworm feeder and we have one seed feeder. I typically take down the suet feeders, and I take down an additional seed feeder once the rose-breasted grosbeaks go through. But the warblers and vireo and everything else, they don't come into those feeders. They simply follow in the other birds, the titmouse, the chickadees, and the bluebirds and everything else. So the idea behind it was once we got them into that area, we had to give them something to forage for. So we started planting wildflowers around those feeders and below them, and we have some shrubs. The only non-native species of shrubs that we've got are some crepe myrtles and butterfly bush. And in order to get our certification as a wildlife sanctuary, we had to make sure that stuff would be contained. It had to be a percentage of what's on the property, and it ends up being maybe 1%. So all those things attracted insects in, and attracting the insects in, it also gave them something to feed on. And all this has worked together really, really well. Well, rambling on a little bit, but long story short, 2 years ago, our yard finally received certification as an Atlanta Audubon Wildlife Sanctuary. And really happy the day that it was done. The person that came up was talking about how their favorite warbler, and one of the birds that got them into bird watching in the first place, was a black-throated blue warbler. And one of the first birds to land in the backyard the day that she was here was a black-throated blue warbler. So I think that was sort of what locked us in, is getting the certification. I mentioned earlier that the first 2 years I was here, we photographed 6 different species of warblers in the yard, and that was wandering around and everything else. And as you see the way that I've got the studio set up, it's increased every year, very substantially from like years 2 and 3 and 3 to 4. Last year and the year before, I photographed 26 species of warblers from my back porch. And again, they don't feed from the feeders. We have to get them something that once they follow these other birds in to the feeders, we have to give them something to search for and to find and enjoy. So all the flowers, they either pick the seeds on some of the birds that come in, goldfinches, the chickadees, of course, but then the other birds come in and they pick insects, they glean insects off of things. We get Japanese beetles, and the Japanese beetles apparently are a preferred food of scarlet tanagers. There was one day 2 years ago that I had 12 scarlet tanagers in the crepe myrtles picking off the Japanese beetles. Made for some great photography. The light was incredible. I'll make sure I put that image in here as well. But I think that the key here is there are certain things that you have to have in your yard. And we're lucky enough to have a stream about maybe 50 yards down the hill. You have to have a water source, you have to have cover, and you have to have food. So the food comes from the seeds, and then the insects that are decaying the flowers and everything else. The cover comes from 2 sources. We leave brush piles. It decays, but at the same time it creates cover for the birds that are foraging and even nesting and everything else. So we have brush piles throughout the yard. They're far enough away from the house. Living in the mountains, a fear is always wildfires. So we make sure that any brush pile that we have is far enough away from the house that it would never, come close to the house. But I do maintain a few of those, and when we trim some branches, we put those in there. And it's one of those things that we've needed. So we've got the water source. We also put a bird bath in the backyard. We've got water, we've got food, we've got cover. I've also provided nesting sites throughout the yard. If we have a tree that's got holes in it, we don't take it down, we leave it up. We get a lot of birds nesting in those holes. I've got a couple bird houses out for bluebirds, chickadees, titmouse. The downspouts have become, the top of the downspouts have become nesting spots for eastern phoebe. A watering can that was sitting on the back porch, and we went out of town one weekend, turned out to be a nesting spot for Carolina wrens, which you can hear over here singing away. After the tin can started leaking, we just screwed it into the side of the wall, and every year we get Carolina wrens that are nesting. Last year had 4 broods out of that can, so it's just kind of neat. I mean, the stuff that you get to see, and as a photographer you get to photograph, it's great. So a little bit, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you on a little bit of a tour just to show you the different areas of the yard so you can get a better idea of what I'm referring to, because we've got the high canopy, then we've got this open area. To draw the birds in, that cover that I talk about that's so critical and crucial, I call that my transition area. We've got some hills we've let blackberries grow. We've let some smaller trees and stuff grow. And all of that provides the nesting sites and the cover that some of the birds, the northern cardinals and a lot of the warblers, depend on for their nesting sites. So we've created that transition area from our house to the trees themselves is probably 50 to 75 feet. And in the backyard where you'll see the studio, that transition area ends, or there's 2 different ones, but one of them ends at the crepe myrtles, which is about 15 to 20 feet away from the back porch. So there's a barrier of 30 to 45 feet or so between those and the high canopy. And like I said, the birds come to those cover areas, and that's crucial, and it also aids in my photography, because as you'll see, where my bird studio is at, I've put posts up that the birds land on the post, waiting their time for the feeder or just pausing to check things out. That's when I take the images of the birds. But it's also, 5 or 6 feet away from those posts, and in some cases even a little bit further. It creates a nice smooth background for my images. So it's almost like putting a background and a post there and the birds coming and landing on it. But with these, the birds actually go into that background as well and forage for insects, which gives me more opportunities to photograph. So I think that the hardest thing for us was we always enjoyed a neat and orderly yard, and it still is neat and orderly, but we allow things to decay. We leave our flowering, or our flowers that seed, coreopsis and coneflowers and everything else, we allow those to remain up during the winter time because it's a food source for a lot of the chickadees and titmouse and goldfinches. We don't cut those flowers down until the spring. So just knowing that we need to allow those things to decay, that's been the biggest thing. That was the step to getting those birds in. So, like I said, we'll tour, and I'll show you exactly how I've built the bird studio, because people think I'm weird when I talk about a lot of times I carry a chainsaw in the car. When you live in the mountains, there's storms, and if you're going to try to get home and a tree's blown down, you've got to be able to cut it down. We live 20 minutes away from the nearest town, so it's not like they patrol the area at night when there's a storm, and we have to do it a lot ourselves. So, but I find a lot of snags and blowdowns that become great posts to stick in the backyard in that bird studio. And what I've done is I've simply taken T-posts and put them into the ground, and then I've attached with wire some of those blowdown limbs and branches, and even stumps that I find in the woods. I attach those to the post, and that's what I use as my perches inside of the bird studio. But again, we'll show you all that. But what I want to do is I just want to encourage you to get out, do some photography in your yard. It's nice living in an area where I've got this amount of bird life that comes through in the migration in spring and fall and the summertime. But you can do it even on a back porch. Simply attaching a post to your a rail on a post or on a porch or something like that. That in itself will get birds to a point where you can photograph. So we're going to talk about the gear that I use. We're going to talk about the settings that I use. And I'm going to just give you a quick tour of the area around here, just to give you an idea of exactly what I'm referring to when I talk about high canopy and transition area. So let's go take a tour. Okay, so this is the area that's directly behind the bird studio. And I'm going to pan over here to the left and I'll show you where the bird studio is at. There's my back porch over there, or just to the left out of the picture. These are my flower beds, raised flower beds. We put wildflowers and we put vegetables in there. And we put flowers, the wildflowers that are native to the area that also attract butterflies and birds and everything else. But these main areas that you can see over here, this is my high canopy. These are the big tall trees. Then this area right in front is a couple crepe myrtles and some butterfly bush. And then you can see on the left hand side of the frame there's more crepe myrtles and butterfly bush as well. And then in the center further down, you can see on the side of the hill there's some blackberries, there's pokeweed, and some other grasses and stuff. And all of these are the things that create that comfort for the birds when they're making that transition of flying in from the high canopy towards the backyard. They've got that cover of those crepe myrtles and those bushes and everything else. So that's critical to set up. If you've got an open area, you need to plant some trees, you need to plant some shrubs to get the birds to the point where they feel safe coming out of the high canopy and approaching the backyard. Again, it's just what the warblers come in and they get into those crepe myrtles, they get into the butterfly bushes, and they start to find insects that are there, crickets, spiders, other stuff. It's just getting them closer in. Once they get in there, the wildflowers that are there, they start to really start to glean for insects and everything else. So all of this is part of building that environment. And you can see in the foreground over here on the left hand side, we just did end up cutting down the flowers that had died off last year, and I just let them decay in place as well, because again it just attracts insects. We put the leaves out there. Everything that we're trying to do is as naturally occurring as possible, so it's all helped to get those birds in there. So now let's go take a little bit of a look at the bird studio itself. So this is the view from the back porch where I sit and photograph the backyard bird studio. And just to give you an idea, my chair is just out of the frame down to the right. The camera, then I've got the background with the one feeder. Then over to the left is where some other feeders are at, but the birds come in and they land in these crepe myrtles back here and go to the feeders. The warblers tend to either go to the post or to the crepe myrtles. So this is the view from that chair that I showed you. This is where the camera would normally be. And you can see that I can, if I want to, I can photograph over at the feeder itself. But all the interest is really straight ahead. You can see the posts, and I'll do some close-ups of those posts for you, and the worm feeder. But the gardens underneath those will all be full of vegetables and flowers. And again, that's where the warblers look for their food, as they forage in those in the flowers and look for everything that's there. You can get a pretty good idea here. Those crepe myrtles that are just at the edge of that fence line, and then if I pan up just a little bit, you can see the upper canopy. So the birds fly in from that high canopy, come down to the crepe myrtles, then go to the post, and that's when I get to do the images, when they fly in those posts or in the crepe myrtles there. So very, very simple to do. You just have to have that transition area between the high canopy and open area to give the birds cover while they come into the feeders and forage for food and insects and everything else they're looking for. So very, very easy setup. Now let's go take a look at those posts. So this is the post where the birds will come and land. There's several of them that are here. This is one of them, and the closest to the porch. And you can see as I pan down, I'll adjust the shutter speed here so it gets a little more light in there. You can see how there's just a wire that attaches it to a simple T-post in several places. And these are the things I find along the side of the road. or in the backyard, and just attach them to the post for the birds to land on. So here is one of the posts, and you can see this is the one that's probably 12 feet from the back porch. Using a 600mm lens, it would compress it really nicely. Just behind that post are the crepe myrtles that help to form that nice smooth background. And that's what gives me that separation. I've got 6 feet, 5 feet between that post and the crepe myrtles. So photographing with a 600mm lens from the porch, 12 feet away, it's going to really make a big difference and give you a nice smooth background. Okay, I'm going to sort of pan around here just to give you an idea of how I've got it set up. There's another post here. Behind it is a hummingbird feeder. And up above it is, oops, a lot of poop on that thing. Up above it is the worm feeder. Then over here is the post that I showed you earlier. So I've got 3 posts that are at this one, and I also have a little, like a pitchfork type thing that the birds will land on as well. All these gardens below it will be full of flowers. And that's where the warblers will come in and land there, and then the crepe myrtles behind those posts, and that's how they hunt. So looking and foraging for their food. Okay, so let's take a few minutes and talk about the gear that I'm using to photograph the birds. I use all Tamron lenses, and my 2 favorite lenses are the Tamron 100-400 and the 150-600. I use the newer G2 version. That's my primary lens because I want to keep that distance. I'm working off of a monopod, so even if I'm there for 3 or 4 hours, the weight of it doesn't bother me or anything else. If I'm traveling around in the woods, a lot of times I'll carry that 100-400, or if I'm working closer into the parts of the backyard bird studio that you saw, I will use the 100-400. But most of the time I use the 150-600, and I use the Nikon D500 personally. I've also used the Canon 7D Mark II. Both of them work extremely well with this lens, so you can't go wrong if you're a Canon shooter or a Nikon shooter. This is the lens that I would recommend. So let's talk about why. First of all, it comes with the tripod foot, which is very important. Zooms from 150 to 600, but it's still extremely lightweight. So that's something that if you're going to be walking around, you're going to be shooting, and you're going to be moving around constantly, the weight is crucial. So it's what's known as Tamron has a category of lenses called SP, Superior Performance. This is part of that superior performance. It means that the optical coatings are really going to be super sharp. There's going to be great contrast. I'm not going to go into all the technical side of it because honestly I don't know most of the technical side of it. I know it just takes awesome pictures. There's a couple things that I do like about the lens in addition to it's the optical quality. I will set up sometimes knowing that a bird is going to fly to a particular post or a particular spot, and if I'm zooming in or out and I don't want to accidentally do anything with that zoom ring, I can just simply pull the zoom ring forward, and you can see how there's a little bit of a lighter line there. That means the zoom lock is on, so it doesn't turn. To get that zoom to turn, you just simply push it in. If I always want to stay at 600mm, I can just push it at 600mm and leave it at that point by touching the zoom lock. So when I'm traveling though, it's nice because if I'm going someplace to photograph birds, I can just simply click that lock and the zoom locks at that lowest point. So you don't worry about picking it up or any lens creep or anything else. So there are a couple settings on the lens itself that you should be aware of. So one of them is focus range, and it gives you either a full range, 10 meters to infinity, or 10 meters to 2.2 meters. Most of the birds that I'm going to be photographing fall within that 2.2 to 10 meters, but occasionally a bird does land in that canopy that's 70 feet away or whatever it is, and I want to just capture an image just for a record shot showing that the bird was there. So I leave it in full. I've never had an instance where the lens is searching or anything else. If you find that you're in odd light and it does, then go ahead and move it to that lower one if you need to. It's just a flip switch. And it's always got the manual override that you can go in and you can focus manually as well. Autofocus, manual focus, I tend to leave it in autofocus, and I don't have a problem, again, with it searching, so there's no reason for me to. Now, again, sometimes if I'm set up and I'm photographing a particular point, I will put it in manual focus. I'll zoom in to make sure it's sharp, and then I just simply wait for the bird to land. But the majority of the time, I'm moving from one spot to another. Autofocus, manual, we talked about that. So vibration compensation, either on or off. Now, hand holding, I leave vibration compensation on. With a monopod or a tripod, I turn it off because that tripod or that monopod is going to give it the stabilization that you need, so you don't need that vibration compensation. So what I'm doing in the backyard is more than 95% off of a monopod or off of a tripod, so I tend to leave that off. But once I start to wander around the woods or I hand hold, I'll go ahead and I'll flip that on. So you've got 3 settings, mode 1, mode 2, and mode 3. Let me just give you a brief explanation as to what those do. Mode 1 is the one that I use the majority of the time. As you push that shutter release part way down, you see the stabilization, you see the vibration compensation take place, and it's easier to visualize what your image is going to be like. Mode 2 is for panning. Oops, wrong one. There we go. Mode 2 is for panning. So if you're following a bird in flight, you want to put that on because it takes into consideration that panning movement of your body and your camera versus just everything, the different axes of stabilization. So the third mode is you can customize it, but I've just simply got it on the default settings, which as you push that shutter release part way down, you don't see the vibration compensation occurring. It's not until you release the shutter. So if you're in low light and you're photographing, it'll actually give you like an extra stop or so of compensation. So I would recommend if you're going to be in lower light and you need that extra stop. Let's say that you're at a 60th of a second or a 30th of a second, and you're not too confident in your ability to hold it still, go ahead and put it in that mode 3. You could also customize it for video as well. I do some video, but I've always left it on the default setting. So on your camera, whether it be a Canon or a Nikon, a couple of the settings that I would recommend. Of course, autofocus. A lot of the Canon stuff is on the viewfinder or in the screen versus on the side of the camera. Put it in autofocus. I use autofocus single when I'm photographing the birds in the backyard, which simply means each time I push the shutter button part way down, or if you use your back button focus, I tend to use the single because I don't want it, if the bird moves just a little bit, I don't want it to pick up a limb that's near it and focus on the limb and then me get some great shots of a bird that are out of focus. So I use it on that single, and it tends to work. I also use typically single point focus when I'm photographing in the backyard. You've got a lot of options where it'll pick the entire screen, a smaller area of the screen, a group or an area, or single. Again, when I'm photographing in the backyard, I use single because I'm trying to pick out a particular spot in that frame, and that's that bird that I'm photographing. The mode that I photograph in is manual mode, but there's a caveat to that. I use a particular shutter speed and a particular aperture. In this case, I always use f8. And starting out in the morning, I will use 1/125th of a second. As I start to get more light falling onto the studio, the sun rises behind me, so I get some good direct light onto it. As the light increases, I'll also increase my shutter speed. Now, for the ISO, I leave it on auto because there's always going to be areas that are bright, some of the areas in bright light, some of it's in shadow. If the bird goes from a shadow area where I've got the ISO set manually into a bright area and I take the image, it's going to be way overexposed, or vice versa. If it's in the bright area and then it flies to the shadow, I'm not quick enough, and I don't know anyone that is quick enough to get a songbird to stay still long enough to make those adjustments on your camera. So auto ISO will do that for you. With most of the cameras today, you can feel safe up to about 6400 even in your ISO without getting a lot of noise. So I would tend to use, again, the auto ISO, but I also use spot metering or center weighted metering. So wherever my focal point is at in that frame, it's going to place the priority of the exposure setting on that spot as well. So if the bird is in a very, very tiny area of shadow, it's going to take that into consideration, and it's going to meter that particular area and place the priority on that area. I also use, whether it's Canon or Nikon, they've both got it. There's a setting here that is quiet continuous. I think in Canon it's, actually I don't know what it is, silent. I think it's like silent continuous or silent single. But I do that just to reduce the noise that's there. You know, getting the birds to trust you in essence is a big factor. And the less noise they have to deal with, because they're just busy as they're eating, looking around, making sure some other birds aren't coming in to eat them or anything else. So everything that you can do is crucial to getting them feel safe when you're doing that. Now I did mention the single point. When I'm photographing birds in flight, I will switch that over to area or group. If I'm in the woods sometimes and I'm photographing larger birds like hawks or owls or whatever, I may put it onto that bigger setting, or when I go down to the lake below us and photograph the eagles, I will put it on the area or group setting, because I'm looking at covering an area very quickly and trying to focus, and they tend to be a little bit bigger and they fill the frame a little bit more. I think, without really, hopefully I didn't miss anything. We talked about single point, we talked about autofocus single, we talked about as opposed to continuous, we talked about the spot metering or center weighted metering. On the lens, we talked about my favorite lens being the 150 to 600 G2. We talked about the full range, we talked about autofocus, vibration compensation, the different modes, the focus, the zoom lock. So let me just touch on one thing here real quick. You see the foot that's on the bottom here. The monopod that I use when I'm on the back porch, I could use a tripod, but it's just a little more bulky and cumbersome. I'm using one of the Surrey monopods, and there's a couple reasons that I do that. Let me raise this up a little bit so I can get it into the frame a little easier. When you put this into, when you lock it into the head, first I guess I should show you that it's got feet. I love those feet because I can put it there, and if I need to pick up my coffee cup, I can hold onto it with one hand. I don't worry about it. I can actually let go of it. I just put my foot on one of those feet to hold it down. But I like these particular monopods with the feet are more of, they were designed originally for video, and it allows you to pan left and right. Let me lower that just a little bit, get that into the frame. There we go. So it allows me to pan left and right, and this particular head just simply moves up and down. So the nice thing is as I'm photographing, this allows me to almost have a gimbal without having a gimbal out there. It makes it so I don't have a lot of bulk. And again, it's just easy for me to sit on the porch, have my cup of coffee, have my camera and the monopod on the ready to go at any point, and I just leave it set at a point where it's about eye level for me, and as the birds are coming in, I can just loosen it and I can follow the birds everywhere they go. So very quick, very easy. I'm all about convenience and quality, so it works great. And then I can just simply take that foot off. Take the lens off of the tripod, and I'm good. So that's the monopod that I'm using. You could very easily use a gimbal head if you wanted to. I don't find the need for it. It just works perfectly to do it just like this. So we've talked about gear. I think that if there's any questions, obviously you'll have my contact. You can always contact me if you've got a particular camera setup and everything else and you're looking for it. And again, even if you've got just a point and shoot that's got a long zoom capability, a lot of these features that I've talked to you about are going to be available in that point and shoot camera as well. So try to find that. Get your instruction manual out, Google it, whatever you need to. This is my preference, is again just using that Tamron 150 to 600. It's worked great for me for many, many years, and that's why I've stuck with it. So I think that's all for the gear section of this little video. So I do want to thank you for joining me for this video. Hopefully it's been educational somewhat as to how to improve your backyard bird photography. as well as what you can do in your yard to make it more attractive to birds, but also more environmentally friendly as well. Hopefully your success rate goes up. But I think the key is that hopefully you can combine a couple passions and a couple loves. For me, I'm very passionate about my birding. I'm very, very passionate, and I obviously do it for a living, my photography. So being able to combine those two things is just great. When I'm not traveling, I do a lot of traveling. When I'm not traveling, it's nice to know that I can relax and still be productive by going to my back porch with my backyard bird studio and photograph just a great variety of birds. So I think the idea is, everything is stressful enough in life. This is one way to relax, and I really enjoy that. So again, David Akoubian and Bearwoods Photography. You can visit my website at www.bearwoodsphotography.com, and there's some contact information in there if you have any additional questions. So thank you again. Happy birding, happy photography.